The room was sealed tight, stripped of warmth and air. No windows broke the walls, no hint of daylight crept inside. Fluorescent panels hummed above, spilling a harsh white light across dark navy-painted walls and a single steel table anchored permanently to the floor. 3 cameras were mounted high in the corners, their red indicators blinking in slow, deliberate intervals, watching everything, every movement, every breath, every second of silence. Staff Sergeant Mara Vale sat alone at the table. Her palms rested flat against the cold metal surface. Fingers loose, shoulders squared, posture disciplined but not rigid. She did not shift in her seat. She did not tap a finger or roll her neck. Her face revealed nothing. Around her, senior officers stood and sat in immaculate uniforms, sleeves crisp, medals polished, arms folded across chests that had already reached their conclusions. This room was not designed for conversation. It existed to pass judgment. Lieutenant General Harold Vance leaned forward in his chair, elbows settled easily on the desk before him. He glanced down at the folder in front of him, then back up at Mara's face. A smile crept across his lips, the kind shared with an audience rather than its target. "So," he said casually, his voice carrying across the room, "let's talk about your kill count." A few officers chuckled, not loud, just enough to register. Then the sound faded. Mara did not blink. She didn't adjust her posture. She didn't drop her eyes. She remained exactly as she was, silent, still, unmoved, and within that silence, the room seemed to contract, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something they weren't prepared to hear. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories, so you never miss these true accounts of courage. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? Staff Sergeant Mara Vale was in her early 30s, and she looked like the sort of Marine most people would pass without a second glance. Average height, lean frame, hair pulled back tight and practical, uniform pressed, boots spotless, expression neutral. If you saw her in a hallway, you might assume she worked logistics, supply, or some quiet administrative role that rarely earned thanks. Her rank rested plainly on her collar. No flashy ribbons, no colorful spread of medals, nothing that hinted at what she had done or what she had endured. That was the first reason they underestimated her. The second was her file. On paper, Mara Vale was an intentional mystery. Training records that listed only the basics. Deployments referenced only by broad regions. Citations written so vaguely they seemed afraid of their own details. Entire paragraphs blacked out. Whole pages reduced to a single stamped line. Meaningless to anyone without the proper clearance. There were gaps that looked like clerical errors. Months where her unit appeared, but her role did not. Commendations with no narrative. Reprimands that felt oddly sanitized, as if they had been scrubbed repeatedly before landing on a desk. To the people in that room, it didn't resemble secrecy. It resembled favoritism. Some believed she had family connections. Others thought she was being shielded because someone somewhere owed a debt. A few decided she was simply a problem the system had failed to eliminate earlier. And today, they believed, was when the system would finally fix itself. Mara felt those judgments without a word being spoken. In the Marines, you learn to read a room the same way you learn to read weather. You don't wait for the storm to announce itself. You watch the pressure shift, the way the air tightens. She noticed how the colonels avoided her eyes, how the Navy legal officer gripped her pen like a blade, ready to carve her into official language. She saw how even the junior personnel mirrored their superiors' posture, as if condemnation could spread by imitation. Through it all, she kept her breathing measured. In for 4, hold out for 6, slow enough to steady her heart, quiet enough that no one else could hear it. Her gaze remained level, not because she lacked fear, but because she understood what eye contact meant in rooms like this. Too little, and they label you weak. Too much, and they call you insubordinate. So she offered precisely what was required and nothing more. Her hands stayed still, not because she felt calm, but because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing tension. Years earlier, under different lights in a different room, a senior instructor had told her almost gently that the hardest part of service wasn't the mud, or the distance, or the exhaustion. It was learning how to remain still while your name was turned into a story you didn't recognize. She remembered that now, the thought resting on her shoulders like a steadying hand. Mara had enlisted young, like many Marines do, armed with grit but little direction, stubbornness outweighing fear. She came from a place where emotions weren't discussed, where worth was measured by how much you could carry without complaint. Her early years were hard in a way that felt straightforward. Endless days, little sleep, the constant pressure to earn your place without asking for permission. She learned quickly that respect in the Marines isn't granted for intent. It's earned through consistency. Faces from those early years still lingered in her memory. A drill instructor who never raised his voice yet could silence an entire bay with a single look. A teammate who taught her to check every strap twice, not out of anxiety, but because lives depend on habits done correctly every single time. Those memories drifted like distant radio chatter. She didn't allow them to surface. Not here, because her current assignment was the part of her life she could never explain. The language in her orders sounded harmless to anyone who didn't know how to interpret it. Liaison, joint coordination, temporary attachment, support role. Polite terms that painted her as someone moving papers between offices, a clerk with a badge. But she wasn't there to push paperwork. She was there because she had been quietly trusted with things the public would never hear about, and some leaders would never openly acknowledge. That trust came with a cost. Her operational history had been folded into classified channels, buried behind clearance barriers so thick even senior ranks couldn't penetrate them. The more critical her work became, the less she was allowed to say. The more responsibility she carried, the less evidence she could offer. That was the cruel equation. In an institution that celebrates medals and documentation, she had been ordered to exist as a blank page dot, so when people looked at her uniform and saw nothing, that wasn't coincidence. It was policy. When they reviewed her record and found redactions, that wasn't confusion. It was design. When Lieutenant General Harold Vance smiled as if her silence proved her weakness, he wasn't just mocking her. He was mocking a kind of service he claimed to command, the kind that vanishes on order and stays gone. Mara didn't defend herself because she couldn't. One misplaced sentence could violate orders that weren't written in the same ink as the rest of her file. She felt the boundary in her mind like a live wire. Speak too little, and you disappear. Speak too much, and you're destroyed. That was why she remained silent, not out of fear, but out of discipline. And discipline can be a lonely thing in a room full of people. Earlier, before the hearing began, a junior officer had passed by her table and quietly placed a paper cup of water beside her. No words, no smile, just a small gesture that felt strangely human in a room designed to strip people down. Mara hadn't touched the cup. Not yet. She felt the isolation in the way the room kept its distance. This wasn't hatred. Hatred acknowledges importance. This was dismissal, clean, efficient, institutional. Like a file stamped and shelved, that cold indifference was harder to endure. This was a room full of accomplished men and women deciding, without effort, that she wasn't worth understanding, and still she sat there, palms against steel, breathing slow, eyes steady, carrying the weight of everything she could not say. Because sometimes the heaviest burden of wearing the uniform isn't what you've done. It's knowing you did it, and knowing you're never allowed to explain why. Lieutenant General Harold Vance didn't raise his voice when he continued. He didn't need to. The room already belonged to him, and he knew it. He leaned back slightly, fingers interlaced, eyes scanning Mara as if she were a problem he intended to dismantle in front of witnesses. "Let's talk about your deployments," he said calmly, almost conversationally, "because on paper, they don't make much sense." He lifted her file once more, tapping the cover with a single finger. The sharp sound cut through the room, louder than it had any right to be. "Same regions, different units, overlapping timelines," he said evenly. "Assignments that begin without context and end without resolution." He raised his eyes to her. "That's unusual, Staff Sergeant. Even for joint operations." Mara kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. Her breathing remained slow, deliberate, trained. "In for 4, hold out for 6, Vance went on. "South Pacific, Persian Gulf, Northern Arabian Sea." A faint smile touched his mouth. "You've traveled quite a bit." Several officers shifted in their seats. A colonel cleared his throat. At the far end of the table, someone began scribbling notes. "Now," Vance said, settling back slightly, "I'm sure there's an explanation." "There always is." He tilted his head. "Care to explain why your record reads like a travel itinerary, with all the important details conveniently absent?" The question lingered, suspended in the air. Mara didn't move. Her jaw tightened just enough that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained to recognize strain measured in fractions. Her hands stayed flat against the table, fingertips grazing the edge, nails clipped short. "Still, I'm not authorized to discuss specific operations," she said calmly. Her voice was quiet, not weak, controlled. Vance nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Of course you aren't," he exhaled softly. almost a laugh. That does seem to be your preferred response. A few restrained smiles surfaced around the room. Here's the issue, he continued. We're not asking about classified targets or sensitive tactics. We're talking about basic accountability. Who you worked with, what your function was, whether your presence was even, he paused, necessary. The word struck harder than the rest. Mara swallowed once, measured, silent. Vance leaned forward again. Joint operations require some level of transparency, especially when a Marine ends up attached to Navy units without a clearly defined role. He paused. Unless there was no role, the room shifted. Curiosity sharpened into something colder. A Navy captain glanced sideways at another officer, eyebrows raised. A Marine colonel folded his arms tighter. Pen stopped mid-motion. Were you embedded? Vance asked. Or were you simply along for the ride? Mara felt pressure build behind her eyes, not anger, but restraint. The answers were there. They always were. She knew exactly how to dismantle his assumptions, one by one. She also knew she was forbidden to do so. I carried out the duties assigned to me, she said. That's not an answer, Vance replied lightly. That's avoidance. A few chuckles followed, not loud, just enough to register. He let the sound settle, then pressed on. Let's approach this differently. Your evaluations. He flipped another page. Competent, dependable, calm under pressure. He looked up. No criticisms. No specific praise. Very safe wording. Safe, another word designed to diminish. In my experience, he said, that usually points to one of two things. Either you never did anything noteworthy or someone ensured nothing specific ever made it onto paper. He smiled again. So which do you think it is? Mara's eyes stayed fixed on a point just beyond his shoulder. She could feel the attention of the room tighten around her, waiting. For frustration. For defense. For anything. Her breathing didn't change. I followed orders. Vance opened his hands in a small, theatrical gesture. And there it is. He looked around the room. The same answer. Every time. This time the laughter carried more confidence. The hearing continued in that pattern. Question after question. Each one structured to make her restraint resemble guilt. He asked about units she couldn't name. Operations she couldn't acknowledge. Time periods she had been ordered to treat as if they didn't exist. Each response stayed precise, minimal, confined to the narrow corridor she was permitted. And each time, Vance reframed it. She doesn't recall. She can't clarify. She refuses to explain. By the time he called for a brief recess, the atmosphere had fully shifted outside the chamber. The hallway filled with low, overlapping voices, sharp, speculative. I don't understand, someone muttered. If she did something worth hiding, why bring her here? Looks like someone pushed her through. Political, another voice said. Mara sat alone on a bench against the wall, back straight, eyes lowered. She still hadn't touched the water from earlier. Her fingers curled briefly into her palm, then relaxed. In that quiet pause, the strain showed in subtle ways. A tight pull at the corner of her mouth. A controlled exhale held a fraction longer than necessary. What would you have done in her place? Defended yourself or stayed silent? When they returned to the room, Vance wasted no time. Let's address the obvious, he said, voice carrying. Your attachment to a Navy task unit during your most recent deployment. Mara felt the shift immediately. That subject, that line, according to this, he continued, you were present during direct action operations. He glanced at her. At the very least, combat adjacent. She said nothing. Vance's smile widened. Which brings us back to my earlier question. Several people leaned forward. In environments like that, he said, everyone contributes. Everyone carries weight. He paused deliberately. So it's reasonable to ask what was yours. Mara's chest rose and fell. You're asking me to discuss classified material, she said. I'm asking you to account for yourself, Vance replied. There's a distinction. He stood this time, slowly, deliberately, taking a single step closer to her table. Not close enough to invade her space, just close enough to be felt. Silence, he said, can mean many things. Discipline, loyalty. He tilted his head. Or it can mean there's nothing there. The room went utterly still. Mara could feel the edge now, the point where restraint begins to cost more than it protects. She knew exactly where Vance was steering this. Speak and violate orders, or stay silent and appear empty. Her jaw tightened again. She breathed through it. Vance glanced around the room, then back to her. You understand how this appears, don't you, Staff Sergeant? She nodded once, barely, and you're still choosing not to clarify. Yes, sir, the word echoed. Vance straightened, satisfaction flickering across his face. Very well. He turned back toward the panel. Let the record reflect that the subject has declined multiple opportunities to explain inconsistencies in her service history. Pens began to move. Pages shifted. The sound of official judgment taking form. Mara's eyes dropped to the tabletop. The cold steel beneath her palms felt more stable than the air pressing in around her. She knew what came next. She had known from the moment she sat down. The questions were narrowing now. The space was tightening. And soon, very soon, someone would attempt to fracture the silence by force. Something in the room had slipped slightly out of alignment. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of shift you only recognize after you're spent around danger. That doesn't announce itself. A change in pressure. A pause that lasts half a second too long. Rear Admiral Thomas Keene had not spoken once since the hearing began. He sat 2 seats down from the presiding table. Posture rigid, hands folded, gaze forward. To a casual observer, he looked like just another senior officer attending a procedural matter. But as General Vance pushed ahead, something in Keene's stillness changed. When Mara declined once more to clarify her role, Keene's eyes lifted from the table for the first time. Not toward her but toward the file in Vance's hand. His jaw tightened subtly, the muscle near his ear flexing and releasing once. Controlled, precise, unmistakable. It was the look of a man who recognized a boundary being tested by someone who didn't know it existed. Vance continued, either unaware or unconcerned. You were present during maritime interdiction activity, he said, scanning the page. That's the terminology used here. A legal officer murmured something under their breath. Another officer leaned closer to read. Mara said nothing. Keene's fingers flexed once, then folded again. The language being used was deliberate, carefully vague, but every so often, something sharper slipped through. A phrase that didn't belong in rooms like this. A term that originated somewhere else entirely. At one point, a junior staffer leaned toward a colonel and whispered a reference to night insertion protocols. Not loudly, just enough. The colonel stiffened. His eyes flicked toward Keene, then away. Mara felt the change before she saw it. The way a few officers stopped leaning back and began leaning forward. The way pens paused mid-stroke. The way skepticism thinned into uncertainty. Her composure, previously dismissed as passivity, began to feel wrong to them. People who have nothing crack under pressure. They ramble. They argue. They over-explain. They reach for anger or sympathy or anything that might disrupt the moment. Mara did none of that. She remained exactly as she had from the start. Shoulders squared, chin level, breathing slow and regulated. Her eyes didn't dart. Her hands didn't shake. Even as the questioning sharpened, her control stayed precise, almost surgical. That kind of restraint unsettles people. Vance pressed on, asking again about timelines, about command structures, about why a Marine would be attached to a Navy element without a publicly defined task. He smiled as he spoke, but the smile was thinning now, stretched tight. Mara answered when required, briefly, accurately, without excess. And when she did not answer, she offered no apology for it. Keene watched her closely now, not with curiosity, with evaluation. There came a moment when Vance referenced a training pipeline that didn't exist in any unclassified system. It was meant as a throwaway line, impressive sounding, non-specific. Keene's head turned an inch. The Navy captain beside him noticed and froze. A legal aide frowned down at the table, then slowly closed a folder, as though suddenly uncertain it should be open at all. The room felt unsettled, though no one could yet explain why. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was confusion. Mara sensed their focus shifting not toward what she was saying, but toward what she wasn't, toward the gaps that no longer felt like incompetence, but like walls. Her silence began to register not as evasion, but as containment. At one point, Vance paused mid-sentence, as if expecting her to interrupt. She didn't. The pause stretched. He cleared his throat and continued. Keene adjusted his posture, sitting straighter. His hands separated and rested on the arms of his chair, palms down, a stance more at home on a bridge than in a hearing room. A junior officer near the back glanced briefly toward the door, then back at the panel, unease spreading across their face. No one said it aloud, but the question was forming. What if she wasn't refusing to speak because she had nothing to say? What if she was refusing because saying it would change who had the authority to ask? Vance felt it too, though he didn't yet understand it. His humor sharpened. His questions narrowed. His patience thinned. He leaned closer, pushing harder, trying to pull something out of her. Mara's calm did not fracture. It sharpened. She met his gaze briefly now, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement. as if to say she understood exactly what he was attempting, and exactly why she could not allow it. Keen exhaled slowly through his nose. The room was quiet in a different way now. Not bored, not entertained, watchful, whatever this had become. It was no longer just about a Marine with a thin file. Something significant was being brushed against, and everyone in the room could feel it even if they couldn't yet name it. Somewhere beneath the surface, a line had been crossed. The red lights on the cameras flickered on one by one, a soft click, a faint mechanical hum. The room preparing to remember. People adjusted in their seats. Postures reset. Expressions hardened back into procedure. Whatever uncertainty had surfaced during the recess was pressed down, replaced by order and control. Lieutenant General Harold Vance straightened his jacket and glanced briefly at the recording. Indicators, ensuring they were active. He wanted this preserved. He wanted witnesses. Mara Vale remained exactly where she had been before the break. Same posture, same stillness. If the room had changed, she gave no sign of it. Vance didn't ease back into questioning. He went straight for the edge. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice louder now, sharper, stripped of humor. "Earlier, I asked you a simple question. The room fell silent instantly. You chose not to answer." He stepped closer to the table, placing his hands on its edge, leaning forward just enough to dominate the space without crossing into it. "I'll ask again," he said. "During your last joint deployment, how many enemy combatants did you personally neutralize?" There was no smile this time, no attempt at levity. This was no longer provocation. It was a challenge. Mara felt the weight settle in her chest, heavy, familiar. The kind of pressure she had trained under. The kind that narrows the world until only one decision remains. Her jaw tightened. She drew one controlled breath in through her nose, held it, released it slowly. Then, for the first time since the hearing began, she lifted her head. Not abruptly, not defiantly, just enough to meet his eyes. The room reacted before she spoke. Chairs creaked softly as bodies leaned forward. A pen slipped from someone's fingers and clattered quietly against the floor. Rear Admiral Thomas Keen's spine went rigid. Mara's expression did not change. No anger, no pride, no hesitation. When she spoke, her voice was even, low, precise. 73. The word landed like a weight dropped into still water. No sound followed it. No gasp, no laughter, no immediate response at all. Just silence. Mara did not elaborate. She didn't qualify the number. She didn't soften it with explanation, justification, or emotion. She offered no timeline, no location, no reason. She stated it the way someone states coordinates, or confirms a count from a checklist. Precise, final. Vance blinked once. Several people in the room stared at her as though their ears had misfired. Someone near the back shifted sharply, chair legs scraping against the floor. A legal officer's pen froze midair, ink suspended above the page. 70-3. It was too exact to be a guess, too clean to be a joke, too large to be casual. And yet she had delivered it without the posture of someone seeking recognition or dominance. That was what unsettled them. If she had spoken it loudly, they could have dismissed it as bravado. If she had spoken it with emotion, they could have labeled it instability. But she hadn't. She had spoken the way professionals speak when facts outweigh reactions. Vance straightened slowly. "That's a serious claim," he said, his voice tighter now. "Are you telling this panel that you personally accounted for 73 enemy casualties?" Mara held his eyes. "Yes, sir, nothing more." A murmur rippled through the room, uneven, uncontrolled. This wasn't laughter. This wasn't dismissal. It was disbelief. A Marine colonel shook his head slightly. A Navy captain leaned back, eyes narrowing, recalculating. Someone whispered the number again under their breath, as if repetition might make it rational. 73. Vance scanned the room, then returned his gaze to Mara. "Over what period?" he asked. "During what operation?" Her eyes didn't flicker. "I am not authorized to discuss operational details." The silence that followed carried weight now. Charged, different. Vance exhaled sharply through his nose. "You expect us to accept that number," he said, "without context, without verification, without documentation. I expect you to record my answer," Mara replied. That was all. Rear Admiral Keen's grip tightened on the arms of his chair. The cameras continued their low hum, red lights blinking steadily, unaware they were recording something already beyond their clearance. The room was no longer aligned with Vance. Even those who doubted her now found themselves doubting him. The balance had shifted, not completely, but enough to be unmistakable. If she were lying, she was doing so with a discipline no one in that room could manufacture. And if she were telling the truth, then something far larger than this hearing was pressing against its walls. Vance sensed his control slipping. He cleared his throat, trying to recover. "And you're comfortable stating that on the record?" he asked. "Yes, sir. No pride, no apology, only certainty." A legal officer leaned toward a colleague and whispered something urgent. A folder was quietly closed, a page turned back. Keen's gaze remained locked on Mara, now sharp, assessing not with suspicion, but recognition. He had seen this before, the calm that comes not from confidence, but from containment, from carrying something too heavy to display. Vance stepped back from the table, jaw clenched. "Let the record reflect," he said, "that the subject has introduced an unsubstantiated claim of lethal engagement." Mara didn't react to the phrasing. She had answered the question. Nothing more. The room didn't know what to do with that answer yet. It hung between them, unresolved, reshaping the space. Whatever Vance had expected, embarrassment, collapse, retreat, this wasn't it. What he received instead was a number that refused to explain itself, and in that refusal, the first real fracture appeared in the authority he thought he commanded. Rear Admiral Thomas Keene stood without asking permission. The scrape of his chair across the floor cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. Every head turned before he spoke. Authority shifted instinctively, the way it does when someone who truly holds it decides the moment has gone far enough. "Cut the recording," Keene said. The order wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A technician hesitated, eyes flicking toward General Vance. Keene didn't look at him. "I said cut it. Now." The red lights blinked once, then went dark. The hum faded. The room felt suddenly exposed, like a stage after the curtain falls. Keene turned to Vance, with respect. "General," he said evenly, "you have exceeded your authority." A ripple passed through the room, not sound, but reaction. Spines straightened, pens stilled, breaths held. Vance opened his mouth. Keene raised a hand, stopping him mid-word. "This is no longer a personal clarification," Keene continued, "and it never should have been conducted in an open forum." His eyes swept the room, measuring clearance with the precision others reserved for rank. "Anyone without Joint Special Access authorization will exit immediately." No one moved. Keene's gaze hardened. That was not a suggestion. Chairs began to shift. Confused officers exchanged looks, then stood. A few protested quietly. A legal aide gathered papers with trembling hands. Within moments, more than half the room had emptied. The door closed behind them with heavy finality. Only a small group remained. Keene turned back to Mara Vale for the first time since the hearing began. His expression softened not into sympathy, but recognition. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "you were correct to maintain silence." He faced the remaining officers. "The operation referenced here exists. Its designation, scope, and outcomes remain classified beyond standard reporting systems." Vance stiffened. "Admiral, if such an operation..." Keene cut him off without raising his voice. "You were not read into it, General, and you were not meant to be." The words settled like a correction carved in stone. Staff Sergeant Mara Vale served in a direct operational capacity under Joint Command Authority. Keene continued. "Her assignment was lawful. Her actions were authorized. Her record appears incomplete because it was intentionally redacted." He paused, letting it sink in. "She answered your question accurately," Keene said, "and she did so with restraint." No one spoke. Mara remained still, eyes forward, hands steady. The weight she had carried finally had a name in the room, even if its details did not. Keene turned back to her. "You are dismissed from this hearing pending reassignment under my office." Mara rose smoothly, one clean salute. Controlled, exact. As she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. One by one, officers stood. Not because protocol demanded it, not because rank required it. They stood because understanding had finally arrived. Assumption had been replaced by understanding. Judgment had given way to respect. The room remained completely silent as Mara walked out. Her boots struck the floor in measured, even rhythm. And in that quiet, everyone left behind arrived at the same realization. They had not been judging a Marine who refused to speak. They had been standing in the presence of one who could not. The resolution came without ceremony. Rear Admiral Keene returned to the table after Mara exited. His voice low, firm, final. He stated that the hearing was terminated effective immediately. All pending concerns regarding Staff Sergeant Mara Vale were dismissed in full, due to classified operational constraints. No appeal, no amendment, no further review. The words were spoken quietly, but they altered everything. General Vance stood rigid for a moment, as though expecting a follow-up that never came. His expression tightened, then flattened. The confidence that had carried him through the hearing drained from his posture, leaving something brittle in its place. Keen continued without looking at him. Staff Sergeant Vale will be reassigned under my direct authority, he said. Her current evaluation status is closed. Any attempt to reopen it without my written authorization will be considered a violation of command protocol. No one objected. No one even shifted. The officers remaining in the room understood what had just occurred. This was not a favor. It was a correction. The door opened again, and Mara Vale stepped back into the room. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. Her stride was steady, unchanged from the moment she first entered that space. If she felt relief, it didn't show. If she felt vindication, she didn't claim it. Keen faced her. Staff Sergeant, he said, your reassignment is effective immediately. Yes, sir, she replied, nothing more. Then something moved through the room like a soundless wave. Chairs slid back. One officer stood, then another, then another. There was no command, no signal, no exchanged glance. They stood because it felt wrong to remain seated. They stood because silence had grown heavier than any order. Mara paused. For the first time since the hearing began, she seemed to register the room not as a threat but as a presence. Her eyes moved briefly, taking it in. Senior officers, legal staff, commanders who had judged her moments earlier, all on their feet. She did not react the way people expect in moments like this. There was no visible release of tension, no softening, no smile. She squared her shoulders and raised her hand. The salute was clean, controlled, exact, not hurried, not embellished. It was the salute of someone who respects the uniform more than the moment. Keen returned it without hesitation. Around them, the room remained frozen. There was no applause, no murmurs, no whispered commentary. The silence carried more weight than noise ever could. General Vance remained seated. His hands rested on the table where he had leaned so comfortably before. His eyes followed Mara, but they did not meet hers. The contrast was impossible to miss. The Marine questioned for her silence now stood acknowledged without speaking. The general who had spoken the most sat exposed by his certainty. Mara lowered her hand and turned toward the exit. Her boots echoed against the floor, each step unhurried, even. The room did not move until the door closed behind her. Only then did people breathe again. Keen stayed standing a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the empty doorway. Then he turned back to the table. This concludes the matter, he said. No one argued outside. The hallway felt brighter though the lights were unchanged. Mara paused once, just long enough to adjust a strap on her uniform. A small habit. Automatic. Then she continued forward. She did not look back. The moment had passed not with a speech or a declaration, but with recognition earned through restraint. In a system built on rank and volume, it had been the quietest Marine in the room who carried the greatest weight. And everyone who stood had felt it. Mara Vale did not linger after the hearing. She moved down the corridor with the same measured pace she had carried all morning, passing doors that now seemed smaller than before. The building hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. But the pressure in her chest had shifted, redistributed into something quieter, something manageable. 2 days later, she stood in a very different room. The Pentagon conference space was wide, bright, functional. No cameras, no raised days, no audience waiting to be entertained. Just a long table, digital maps projected on the walls, and a handful of officers whose attention was focused, not predatory. No one joked. No one smirked. Rear Admiral Keen introduced her simply. No embellishment, no numbers, no war stories, just her name, her role, and why she was there. The questions that followed were sharp but clean. Not traps, tests, patterns of movement, timing windows, behavioral markers that appear before escalation. What looks like noise until you know how to read it. Mara answered calmly, choosing her words with the same care she had shown in the hearing. But now, the silence between her sentences wasn't hostile. It was attentive. She gestured toward a cluster on the map and explained why it mattered. She didn't reference herself. She didn't recount what she had seen or done. She spoke about probability, about repetition, about how certain tactics don't change because they don't need to. A Navy commander challenged her once, politely, asking whether field experience truly translated into strategic forecasting. Mara paused, then nodded. Double quotes, only if you leave your ego out of it, she said. That was all. No one laughed. They listened. When the meeting ended, there was no applause, no congratulations. A few nods as she gathered her notes. One officer held the door. Another thanked her for her time. It was respect stripped of ceremony, and it was real. As she stepped back into the hallway, The reflection settled in, quiet and certain. Some warriors are loud because they need to be seen. Others are silent because what they carry cannot be shared. The system often mistakes the second kind for absence. It rewards volume. It records confidence. It celebrates what can be explained. But truth lives elsewhere. Respect is not noise. Respect is restraint under pressure. Mara Vale did not walk away with a story to tell. She walked away with work to do just as she always had. And in the end, that was the point. Some service is meant to be witnessed. Some service is meant to disappear. For every story that ends with applause or medals, dozens end in silence, carried quietly by people ordered never to speak about what they held together. Their names don't make headlines. Their records remain thin by design. Their courage survives without an audience. Mara's story isn't important because of what she said. It matters because of what she didn't. Because there are thousands like her standing under judgment without defense, trusting that restraint will one day speak louder than explanation. They serve knowing their proof may never come, and they do it anyway. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These stories keep courage alive for generations to come.